Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. Again, we have visitors with us. We appreciate you being here, and especially those who already knew I was going to be preaching today. You came anyway. Appreciate that. Of course, Sam and Natalie and Layla are in Texas visiting Sam's folks, and we expect them back a little bit later this week. But we appreciate you, everyone, being here this morning. And also, I appreciate all the songs that John led. Some of them were special requests, and it's always sometimes a little bit of a challenge to lead songs you're not necessarily familiar with, but John did a great job, and I really appreciate those songs. And there really are a lot of songs in our book that kind of relate to friendship and friends. But first, I want to talk a little bit about loneliness. Not a lot of time, but talk just a little bit of time about loneliness. We all feel lonely from time to time, and that's really not to be unexpected, and that's really not that big a deal. But loneliness seems to be becoming more and more and more of a problem. I read an article in the October 2024 Science Focus magazine talking about the loneliness epidemic, and I'll just share part of this article with you. This loneliness epidemic. It gave an introductory comment. Despite being more connected than ever, we're pretty lonely right now. So lonely, in fact, that in 2023, the World Health Organization declared the loneliness epidemic a global public health concern. Roughly a quarter of the world reported feeling lonely, with young people making up the brunt of that figure. So I think that's pretty interesting. We are way more connected than ever before, but way more lonely as a society. So again, from this slide, from this article, innovations, prepare yourself for tomorrow. Could artificial intelligence be the cure for loneliness? Rates of loneliness are increasing worldwide, but big tech companies think they have the solution. Okay, fear not. The solution is wearable sensors connected to an app on my phone that would prompt me and let me know, hey, I think you're starting to feel lonely. You either need to reach out to a friend or we have this chatbot, this artificial intelligence chatbot that you can have for a friend. And you can, talk to this artificial intelligence electronic friend. I can't think of anything that would make me more lonely than that. That's just kind of a horrifying thought to me. But I want to talk not so much about loneliness right now. I want to talk about friends and kind of shift our focus, because friends really are a pretty good antidote to loneliness. And, friends are generally someone we have something in common with. Someone we enjoy being around, someone we like to talk to, a companion in some of our activities, someone we like to share with, to open up with, maybe show vulnerability to. And there is a bond between friends, and it is important for us to have friends. And actually the Bible tells us that it's important to have friends, and I'm intrigued with how much the scriptures talk about friendship and friends. And so that will be the focus of the rest of our lesson. So friends are important, and they can help us. And we have a lot of scriptures, and rather than have to look them up, we're moving through so many scriptures. All of the scriptures should be on the screen. So Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12 reads, "Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken." So this passage in Ecclesiastes tells us about the importance of friends in these circumstances, and we want friends who will share in our labor. That makes the reward so much greater. It makes the labor so much easier. We want friends who will be there to lift us up when we fall, and we want friends who will help protect us from the elements, and we want friends who will fend off an attacker. Another passage in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17 tells us, as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. So we want friends who, like iron sharpening iron, can make us sharper, stronger, better, more effective. And this connotation of iron sharpening iron kind of implies something like there might be some striking, some friction, some heat, but with a purpose, to make the countenance of a friend sharper from the improvements that it brings. The scriptures also tell us that friendships need to be cultivated. And looking at Proverbs chapter 18, verse 24, a man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. So this verse tells us that to have a friend, we need to be a friend. You know, I've had a lot of very good friends over the years. Some of them I've stayed in touch with and some I've not. You know, we get busy with jobs and families, and sometimes friends change jobs or move out of town, and sometimes those bonds will weaken. My point is, you need to be a friend to cultivate these relationships. You need to have contact. You need to share things. You need to strengthen these bonds of friendship. Otherwise, they are likely to just kind of weaken. You have to invest time and energy in relationships to have friends. And this verse also tells us that a close friend is so valuable, they can be even closer than a brother. But I do want to offer a word of caution about choosing friends. Friends really need to be carefully chosen. We need to carefully choose who we hang around with and cultivate as friends. There's a passage in James chapter 4 that uses this general concept of friendship with the world. Specifically, James chapter 4 and verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. You know, in the context of this in chapter 3, just prior to these verses, James has been contrasting the wisdom that comes from above, the wisdom that God provides, and the fruits of the Spirit, contrasted with the wisdom that comes from the world, the fleshly desires and the fruit of the world, if you will. And in that context, he's talking about be careful who you're hanging around with. There are several other verses that tell us about the kinds of worldly individuals that we should not choose as friends. Proverbs 12 and 26 tells us very plainly, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. You know, that's kind of a powerful verse to me. The righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. Kind of a similar verse in 1 Corinthians 15 and 33. Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. And in Proverbs 22 and 24, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go. You know, these verses are really pretty clear and don't need a lot of commentary, but I think it is pretty clear that we should not surround ourselves with these kind of people, and if we do encounter them, don't allow yourself to be drawn to them or influenced by them. So these verses are warning us of the kind of people we should not consider as good friend material or to even hang around. So I'd like to look at, I think, 3 examples of bad friends in the scriptures. First, I'd like to look at Amnon's friend. We're familiar with the awful story of David's firstborn son, Amnon, and his inappropriate obsession with his half-sister, Tamar. And we'll just read a few verses out of this to kind of set the stage for our conversation about friends and friendship. We'll read 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to him, "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day by day? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill, and when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me food, and prepare the food in my sight that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" So y'all know pretty much how this story plays out, but I want to focus a little bit on Jonadab, this friend of Amnon. Jonadab is described as crafty, he's smart, he's clever. A guy like this has worldly appeal as a friend. But that's the deal. It's a worldly appeal as a friend. But he is Amnon's friend. So Amnon's friend Jonadab, I'll also point out he's Amnon's cousin. And actually, I know we have cousins in the audience. Cousins can be good friends if they're godly. A cousin who is ungodly is not really a good candidate for a good friend. That can make terrible friends, and that's certainly the case with Jonadab. When Jonadab heard this story about what Amnon desired, what he wanted, Jonadab could have and should have discouraged Amnon. He should have told him his desires were wrong and he needed to repent of his lustful thoughts and move on. But his friend Jonadab was not iron sharpening iron. Instead of rebuking or admonishing or encouraging Amnon to do the right thing, he actually encouraged and helped him down a sinful path, telling him how he could trick his father David and give him an opportunity to rape his half-sister Tamar. So Jonadab's friendship contributed mightily to Amnon's sin. But Amnon gets even worse if you don't think he's despicable enough. The same Jonadab later befriends Amnon. The same friend Jonadab later befriends Absalom, Tamar's full brother. Now Absalom hated his brother Amnon for what he had done to his sister. And after some time had passed, Absalom talked David into sending all of his sons, including Amnon, to a feast at Baal Hazor. Absalom then kills Amnon at the feast, and as everyone scrambles out of the chaos, David, back at the kingdom, hears that all of his sons have been killed. And of course, David is devastated. Unbeknownst to David, all of his sons were not killed. The rest of them, other than Amnon, who was killed, were frantically riding back to Jerusalem. Now, Jonadab, first Amnon's friend, and now Absalom's friend, was conveniently in the palace with the king, apparently. And we'll pick up the rest of the story, or the end of the story, in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 32 through 33. Then Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, answered and said, "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead." Wow, there's good news for you. "For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore, let not my lord the king take this thing to heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." So how did Jonadab know that only Amnon was dead and the rest were alive? Because Jonadab knew Absalom's plan. He had befriended Absalom and now conspires with Absalom to kill his ex-friend Amnon. What a scumbag. So again, Jonadab was crafty, he was clever, he was smart. He was a very poor choice of friends for both Amnon and then to Absalom. His friendship led to the death of both of his friends and contributed to the deaths of many other innocent lives through Absalom's later rebellion against his father David's kingdom. So this is one great example of why we need to choose our friends carefully. We want friends who will provide good counsel, friends who will talk us out of bad ideas, friends who will encourage us to be a better person, especially in the eyes of God. And by the way, if you have friends like Jonadab, you don't need any enemies. Let's look at another example of a bad choice of friends in the Bible. And we'll look at Haman's friends as a second example. Remember, of course, in the story of Esther, Haman was the chief prince in the court of King Ahasuerus, but Haman was consumed with hatred of Mordecai the Jew and subsequently all Jews. He hated Mordecai so much that he couldn't be happy as long as Mordecai lived. He nurtured his hatred, and it grew and grew until Haman plotted to kill not only Mordecai, but to slaughter all the Jews in the kingdom. As we remember the story, Haman was invited to dine with King Ahasuerus and the beautiful Queen Esther. We'll pick up the story at that point in Esther chapter 5, verses 9 through 14. So Haman went out that day and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. In a real twist of irony, and obviously with the unseen hand of God orchestrating events, Haman is exposed in his wicked plot to destroy God's people, the Jews in King Ahasuerus' kingdom. And the king's anger is aroused against Haman. We'll finish this aspect of the story in Esther chapter 7, verses 7 through 10. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. So the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Let's think back to a little bit of the story when Haman encountered Mordecai. He was so upset, but it says he controlled himself, or he got a hold of himself, and he was a little calmer. But he goes and he tells his wife and his friends and about his frustration with Mordecai, and they say, oh, build this gallows. Instead of calming Haman down at this point, trying to talk some reason into him, they played into his ego, and they encouraged him to build a gallows, not 6 cubits high that would have been adequate, or 8 cubits high, which certainly would have been adequate. They said, build a gallows 50 cubits high. I think that's 75 feet to destroy your enemy, Mordecai. So the advice of his wife and his friends had kind of a bad outcome for Haman. Haman chose his friends poorly, and their advice cost him his life. A last example of bad friends in Scripture, and we'll look at Job's friends. So I don't think I would put Job's friends in the same category as Jonadab or Haman's friends, but they were flawed. In Job chapter 2, verse 11 says, Job's 3 friends came to comfort him. That was a good gesture, but they kind of grew judgmental and critical. And then rather than comforting Job, they started accusing him and adding to his misery. I assume Job in chapter 12 and verse 4 and in 16 and 20 is primarily addressing his 3 friends, where he says, I am one mocked by his friends, and my friends scorn me. And he may have been talking about other friends more broadly, but I'm sure he's also addressing these 3 friends again. In 19 and 14, he says, my relatives have failed, and my close friends have forgotten me. And all in 19 and 19, all my close friends abhor me, and those I love have turned against me. So Job's friends have turned against him, and very much we read about these 3 friends who have turned against him. Job needed comforting. He needed companionship. He needed sympathy. And apparently he had been abandoned by virtually all of his friends, and the 3 that came to him offered uninformed accusations and condemnation rather than the comfort and sympathy that Job so desperately needed. So we've looked at 3 examples of bad friends in scriptures. Let's look at some examples of some good friends and see what lessons we can draw. So good friends. The first one that comes to mind is Daniel and his friends. So Daniel's taken captive to Babylon as a very young man. He had 3 companions with him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 4 friends went through a lot together. But despite their difficult circumstances, they planned to serve God even while captive in Babylon and surrounded by bad influences. These friends no doubt encouraged and helped each other. You know, one night, I assume at night, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he asked the wise men of the kingdom to first describe this dream to him and then provide its interpretation. The wise men asked Nebuchadnezzar, tell us the dream, and then we'll tell you the interpretation. But Nebuchadnezzar knew if he told them the dream, they would come up with something, true or not. So obviously they can't tell him the dream. So Nebuchadnezzar's solution is, let's put all the wise men to death. Well, that included Daniel and his friends, or at least Daniel for sure. Daniel was able to gain a quick audience with the king and ask for time that he might interpret the dream for him, and then Daniel immediately went to his friends. So in Daniel chapter 2, verse 17 and 18, we read, Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So God answered their prayers, and that night revealed to Daniel in a vision both the king's dream and its interpretation, which saved the lives of Daniel and his friends. So Daniel and his friends had been thrown together in captivity, but they nurtured their relationship. They became friends and encouraged and helped each other to remain faithful to God throughout their captivity. Let's look at David's friend Jonathan, another great example of a great friend in the Bible. Jonathan and David, of course, were very close friends. If we look at 1 Samuel 18 and 1, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. You know, Jonathan was a real stand-up kind of guy. He was a faithful and godly man. He was a good servant to his father Saul and to the kingdom. He was brave. And when Jonathan made a promise or a covenant, he kept it. He tried to help David and his father Saul reconcile, but of course Saul wouldn't have anything to do with it. Jonathan saved David's life while putting his own life in peril on multiple occasions. At one point, as David is hiding out in the wilderness of Ziph, evading Saul, in 1 Samuel 23 and 16, reads, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. I'm not real sure what that phrase means, strengthened his hand in God, but I know Jonathan put his life at risk by going there. I suspect he provided supplies, food, encouragement, and no doubt prayers to God on David's behalf. So Jonathan is the kind of guy you want to pick for a friend. Godly, faithful, loyal, a friend who offers godly encouragement, good advice, and who looks out for your best interest. Let's look at Paul's friends. 3 quick verses, Acts chapter 19 and 31. Then some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Acts 24 and 23, so he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And Acts 27 and 3, and the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So in Acts 19, Paul's friends kept him from entering an angry mob in Ephesus who would likely have killed him. In Acts 24, his friends visited him, provided for him, and gave him encouragement. And again in Acts 27, Paul's friends provided care for him. So again, these are the kinds of friends we want. Friends who will look out for our best interest, and when needed, will protect us, provide for us, help us, and care for us. And I'd like to look at one more example of good friends in the Bible. So I'd like to look at the story of the lame man, and we'll look at the passage in Luke. It's recorded in Matthew, Luke, and John, and we'll look at Luke's account in Luke chapter 5, verse 18 through 20. And by the way, in none of these passages are these men called this man's friends. And I checked a couple of other different versions, couldn't find where at any point these guys were identified as this lame man's friends. I think if we look at the story, I think you'll agree with me, these guys were friends. These were the kind of guys we want for friends. So in Luke's account, then behold, men brought on a bed a man who was paralyzed, whom they sought to bring in and lay before him. And when they could not find how they might bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the housetop and let him down with his bed through the tiling into the midst before Jesus. When he saw their faith, he said to him, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." So Jesus forgives this man's sins, and then he goes on to heal him, this man's sins. But I'd like to consider the dedication these men had to their friend. They carried this lame man, jostled him around, tried to maneuver him through a crowd and get him up through the door, but they can't get him through the door because the crowd is so big. They find rope, they climb up on the roof, carrying the weight, carrying the dead weight of a paralytic. Then they pull off enough tiles to get him through the roof and lower him down to Jesus. These were good friends. And these are the kind of people that we want to cultivate as friends. We want to cultivate friends who want nothing but the best for us. Importantly, these guys had faith in Jesus. And those are the best kinds of friends you can have. So I want to look at seven kind of practical lessons from what we've studied so far. First of all, it is very good to have good friends. Importantly, we need to choose our friends carefully. We need to choose friends that are dependable. We need to choose friends that seek our best interest and want the best for us, give good advice, and importantly, talk us out of foolishness. We need to choose godly friends, ones who will help us please the Lord and help us get to heaven. We've learned to be a friend. To have a friend, you need to be a friend. And we need to nurture friendships. So where might we find good prospective friends? You know, can you find good friends at work or at school? Yes, you can. But you need to seek out godly people. Can you find good friends at your local bar? Highly unlikely. How about amongst fellow Christians? Definitely. Look around the audience with the people you are worshiping with this morning. These are the kinds of people that can be a great source of potential friends. People who love God, serve God, want to follow God, want nothing but the best for their friends, for their neighbors. So kind of the last point I would say is make friends of God's children. But a word of caution. Friends can betray you. They're human. Human friendships are not perfect. Our friends can sometimes disappoint us, even betray or harm us. An insult by an enemy or a stranger or even a casual acquaintance isn't all that hurtful, but from a spouse or a close friend, that's pretty painful. That's devastating. Jesus warned us that our friends on earth might betray us even for the sake of our faith. He told his early disciples in Luke 20, he tells us in Luke 21, 16 through 19, you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls. And Jesus himself was even betrayed by one of his friends. In Matthew 26, 47 through 50, and while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, friend, why have you come? So, as important as human friendships are, friends can disappoint us. But there is one friend who will never disappoint or betray us, and that is God's Son, Jesus. Mike's comments at the Lord's table struck me this morning about Jesus feeling alone, and I kind of thought, Jesus was alone during the temptation in the wilderness. Jesus was alone really in the Garden of Gethsemane because his friends were away and asleep and couldn't even, stay awake with him. Jesus was betrayed by his friends, and I think his own father turned his back on Jesus for a time when he was carrying my sins at the crucifixion. So Jesus knew what it felt like to be alone. But Jesus can sympathize with us, and he has told us he will never leave us. In Hebrews 13, verses 5 through 6, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Jesus also tells us in John chapter 15, 9 through 15, as the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all things that I heard from my Father I have made known to you. So clearly, Jesus is seeking us as friends. Jesus will protect us. Jesus will help us. He will provide for us. Through his word in the scriptures, he admonishes us when needed, and if we listen to him, he'll talk us out of foolishness, because Jesus wants nothing but the best for us. He loves us so much that he laid down his life for us, taking our sins that we might be reconciled to God and enjoy life eternal with him in heaven. He tells us in verse 14 that we will be his friends by doing whatever he commands. And Jesus' commands, another one in Matthew 22, when responding to a lawyer's question of, teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus responded in verse 37 of Matthew 22, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now that first command, loving the Lord with all our heart, soul, and mind, that sounds to me like becoming a friend of God. And the second, loving my neighbor as myself, sounds like being a friend to my neighbor. You know, another one of the commandments that Jesus gives us is to follow him and to be baptized into him for the remission of our sins. So John is going to lead us in when the roll is called up yonder in a moment. If you have not made Jesus your friend through baptism, we can assist with that this morning, or we can help you cultivate that relationship, that friendship. Or if you've been a friend of Jesus, but you've kind of neglected that relationship, not nurtured that relationship, and you've become a little bit more of a friend of the world, if there's anything we can do to help restore that friendship, I'll be in the back here in a few moments. And if there is anything we can do, you can see me or you can see one of the other elders. But if you would be standing, then John will lead us in when the roll is called up yonder.